Hello, my friends, and welcome to Night Whisper. This is a quiet place where we drift together into unanswered skies, slowly, calmly, and without fear. Here, we don't rush toward conclusions. We listen, we observe, and we let the mystery breathe. If these stories bring you a sense of calm or keep you company through the night, you're always welcome to stay with us. Subscribing gently helps this space grow, and it allows more quiet minds to find their way here. You can also leave a soft, like if the story helps you relax, unwind, or feel less alone beneath the night sky. And if any thoughts rise as you listen, you're welcome to share them in the comments below. And just out of quiet curiosity, where are you listening from tonight? I love seeing how far these whispers travel through the dark. Chapter 1. The Quiet Call from the Sky. The sky, at 39,000 feet, has a way of making you feel both incredibly small and strangely suspended in a quiet kind of wonder. From inside the cockpit, the world below stretches into a patchwork of forests, rivers, and mountains, muted under a pale, drifting light. Clouds sit like frozen waves, their edges brushed with the softest silver, and everything moves with a deliberate, timeless rhythm. It is a place where the ordinary seems almost sacred, and yet it is also a place where the extraordinary can slip in silently, without fanfare or warning. Most mysteries, in truth, do not arrive with the dramatic announcements of a storybook tale. They do not thunder into existence with a crash or a flash. They drift in gradually, imperceptibly at first, until the mind pauses and says, "Wait, that doesn't belong." The Alberta Cylinder incident begins exactly that way. Not with alarm, but with a gentle, almost hesitant intrusion into the sky's familiar rhythm. In September 2025, above Alberta's sprawling plains, a commercial airliner cruised in its normal pattern, its passengers oblivious to the sky's quiet invitation to wonder. Pilots had followed these skies countless times. They knew what belonged to their other aircraft, tracked drones, the occasional high-altitude balloon. They had instruments to confirm, to predict, to verify. Everything was controlled. Everything, at least by expectation, was known. And then, without warning, something appeared. It was subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss if you weren't trained to notice anomalies. But the pilots noticed. That is the remarkable part. They weren't scanning for oddities, didn't have time to speculate or dream. They were trained observers, conditioned to detect patterns, trained to recognize the silhouettes of known aircraft, aware of the sky's usual rhythms and anomalies. And yet, what emerged in front of them didn't fit any pattern they knew. A shape, smooth and elongated, hovered high above the earth. It had no wings, no rotors, no flashing lights to identify it. There was no exhaust, no signal of propulsion, only presence. It drifted, then paused, as if considering its own existence in the open sky. And then, it moved not gradually, not predictably, but in a motion that defied expectation. It accelerated, leaving only the memory of its form etched briefly against the endless blue. Moments like that linger, not because they prove anything beyond imagination, but because they resist simplification. The mind wants to categorize, to name, to explain. Yet here, nothing fit neatly into existing boxers. And the first reaction, even among trained professionals, was a careful, deliberate, a recognition that something, however fleeting, was genuinely unusual. To understand why that moment matters, it is important to recognize the world around it. Alberta's sky is vast and open, almost empty of the usual distractions that clutter observation in more populated regions. Here, the horizon stretches and blends seamlessly with the clouds. Light pollution is minimal. The air is clear. The conditions are perfect for noticing the subtle, for seeing the unnoticed, and for glimpsing what might otherwise vanish. It is precisely in such spaces that anomalies are first recorded and quietly remembered. But what makes this sighting different from countless others over the decades is timing. By 2025, the public conversation around unidentified aerial phenomena had shifted. no longer whispered on the corners of online forums, no longer dismissed outright as flights of fancy. UAPs were being discussed in government halls and scientific circles alike. The United States Congress had begun hearings that framed UAPs as serious subjects deserving scrutiny. Canada had launched the Sky Canada project, formally acknowledging that unknown objects in national airspace warranted structured scientific attention. And so, when the Alberta Cylinder appeared, it did so in a world quietly prepared to take notice. Yet, it didn't come as a viral video from a backyard phone camera. It came from trained pilots, whose lives depend on knowing the skies with precision, whose judgments carry the weight of passenger safety. Observation from such a source is different. It carries authority not because of speculation, but because of disciplined attention, careful measurement, and the habits of a lifetime spent watching the sky. There were no cameras capturing this particular object for the public. No infrared footage released, no stabilized video to dissect frame by frame. Only words, reports, and a rare sense of shared understanding among those present. And perhaps that absence, the lack of visual proof, made the encounter more compelling. In a world where everything is recorded and archived, where every movement is documented, the Alberta sighting remained ephemeral, existing primarily in memory and testimony, resisting easy categorization. This is where human perception comes into play. Witnesses describe objects, but words are limited. Cylinder, pill-shaped, smooth, are attempts to translate an extraordinary observation into familiar language. Observers may notice heat, subtle atmospheric disturbances, or the faint impression of motion in a medium where movement is otherwise expected to obey physics as we understand it. And when multiple trained observers independently record similar impressions, the question naturally arises: is there a pattern here? Patterns are not new to this world. Cylindrical UAPs have appeared before. Project Blue Book, in the 1950s, cataloged dozens of reports describing elongated, tubular forms streaking across the sky. Many were later explained as balloons, experimental aircraft, or misidentified celestial bodies, but some resisted explanation entirely. The 1950 New York sighting, observed by multiple witnesses, was catalogued and quietly archived, unresolved, leaving only questions behind. Fast forward to 2023. A similar shape appeared over the Yukon, tracked by RCA FCP-140 Aurora aircraft. That object, later called a suspected balloon, carried a car-sized payload and displayed characteristics that drew attention. Officially, it was shot down by military aircraft, a photo released to the public, and the case closed, at least publicly. The Alberta Cylinder, however, followed a different trajectory. There was no intervention, no official confirmation, no photos, silence. And yet, the similarities are striking. Why do these forms reappear across decades, across geography, across technologies? Is there a natural explanation? Perhaps a kind of balloon or drone that behaves in ways we underestimate? Or are they something else, entirely an invitation to notice a question posed to those who watch carefully? It is a delicate balance, observing the unknown without rushing to conclusion. The Alberta incident reminds us that uncertainty is not failure, that careful curiosity is a skill worth cultivating, and that even when the evidence seems small, a fleeting silhouette in a vast sky, it is enough to begin asking questions that matter. Questions like, what did we really see? Who else saw it? How does it compare with previous reports? And, perhaps most importantly, why does this moment capture attention even as it disappears from public view? These questions are not idle. They matter because they reflect how modern societies interact with the unknown. Observation is only the first step. Analysis, documentation, and context are necessary to transform fleeting impressions into understanding. The Alberta Cylinder sits at the intersection of these elements, bridging observation, history, and human curiosity. For the pilots who witnessed it, the moment left subtle imprints, muscle tension. In response to the unexpected, quick adjustments of instruments, careful cross-checking against known patterns. For those who would later read the reports, it posed a quieter challenge. how to think clearly about something that defies easy categorization. It was not frightening, not sensational, but insistent in its subtlety. A gentle nudge from the sky to consider the possibilities beyond what we assume. And as we explore this story, we begin to understand that UAPs rarely exist in isolation. They echo, they repeat, they appear in waves, often coinciding with societal or technological shifts. The Alberta sighting emerged in a period of heightened awareness. Shortly after the Sky Canada Project's recommendations for centralized federal reporting, it reminded the world that observation alone is insufficient. What happens next? How institutions respond? How data is collected? How society perceives the unknown matters as much as the sighting itself. The Alberta Cylinder, then, is not only a mystery of form and motion, it is a reflection of human curiosity, of the need for patience, and of the delicate tension between knowing and not knowing. It asks us to slow down, to listen, to observe without rushing to explain, to be comfortable with ambiguity, and to recognize that sometimes the sky offers questions more than answers. Somewhere above the plains, the object's memory lingers, not as a headline, not as proof, but as a quiet caller. Gentle reminder that the universe is vast, that observation is precious, and that even in our most routine, ordinary moments, the extraordinary can slip in. And when it does, it asks us to notice, to pay attention, and to wonder not with fear, but with deliberate curiosity. And so begins our journey, following the faint echoes of that silent shape, tracing its steps across the sky, across time, and into the quiet spaces where wonder resides. A journey that does not promise answers, only the patient, careful pursuit of understanding in a world that is always just a little bigger than we imagine. The sky awaits. And as the Alberta Cylinder faded from sight, a deeper story began to unfold, one that stretched beyond the object itself and into the hearts and minds of those watching. Chapter 2. Echoes Written in the Sky. Long before the Alberta sky offered its quiet question, long before pilots paused and searched their instruments for answers, the sky had been doing this same thing to humanity again and again, appearing, vanishing, leaving behind a feeling that something had passed, just beyond the edge of understanding. If you listen closely, history hums with these moments. They are scattered across decades, continents, and cultures, woven lightly into official records and personal memories. Not dramatic enough to rewrite textbooks, not clear enough to close the case. Just present enough to linger. The Alberta Cylinder did not arrive alone. It arrived with echoes. In the early 1950s, when jet travel was still new and radar screens glowed like unfamiliar stars, reports began drifting into U.S. Air Force offices. Pilots, radar operators, and civilians described elongated shapes, moving through the sky smooth, tubular forms that didn't behave like aircraft, and didn't fall like meteors. Project Blue Book gave these reports numbers, dates, and brief summaries, trying to tame the unknown with paperwork and procedure. Many cases found explanations: weather balloons, experimental tests, optical illusions caused by altitude and light. But some refused to settle. They sat quietly in files, unresolved, their descriptions eerily consistent across time and distance. Witnesses spoke of objects that held their shape regardless of angle, of movement that felt deliberate rather than chaotic, of moments when the sky seemed to pause, as if something unfamiliar had entered a familiar space. No conclusions followed, just records. Across the Atlantic, something similar unfolded. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Scandinavia experienced what newspapers called the ghost rockets. People watched elongated objects streak across the sky, sometimes plunging into lakes, sometimes vanishing mid-flight. Military investigations suggested meteors, perhaps remnants of early missile tests. Yet divers searched lakes and found nothing. Radar occasionally caught shapes that didn't behave like falling debris. The reports faded. The term ghost rocket slipped into history, but the pattern remained. Decades later, in 1973, over Mansfield, Ohio, a U.S. Army Reserve helicopter crew encountered something that would unsettle investigators for years. A glowing, cylindrical object appeared in the night sky and seemed to follow their aircraft. The pilots adjusted course. The object followed. Instruments malfunctioned. The crew felt an unmistakable pressure, not fear exactly, but the sensation of being observed, tracked, engaged. Official explanations arrived slowly and never quite fit. Misidentified lights. Stress. Venus. The case closed on paper, but not in memory. And then there was New York. Multiple witnesses watched a cylindrical object move steadily 1950. Across the sky, astronomers reviewed the data. Analysts debated possibilities. No answer satisfied all questions. The file was quietly shelved, unresolved, another echo waiting patiently. These were not stories told around campfires. They were documented encounters, written in careful language by people trained to observe and report, and though each case stood alone, together they formed a subtle rhythm. A repetition not of certainty, but of curiosity. By the time the 21st century arrived, technology had changed how these echoes were recorded. Cameras became smaller, sensors more sensitive, satellites more numerous, and yet the essential mystery remained. In 2012, over South Korea, a stabilized camera captured something unusual, a horseshoe-shaped object hovering against the sky, maintaining its orientation as clouds passed behind it. Analysts slowed the footage, examined wind data, debated parallax and perspective. Some explanations worked, others left gaps. The object became a reference point, a visual cousin to descriptions that had existed long before cameras could capture them. Then came the now famous encounters off the U.S. coast objects, labeled gimbal, tic-tac, go fast, shapes without obvious wings, motion without visible propulsion. Pilots describing encounters with calm precision, voices steady even as the situation defied expectation. Governments responded differently this time. Reports were acknowledged, videos released, study groups formed. The conversation shifted, slowly but unmistakably, from ridicule to responsibility. And somewhere in that shifting landscape, the Alberta Cylinder appeared. It didn't streak across the sky like the ghost rockets. It didn't glow like the Mansfield object. It didn't rotate like gimbal. It simply occupied space long, smooth, present before leaving as quietly as it arrived. That restraint is important. Many UAP stories lean toward spectacle. This one leaned toward subtlety. And subtlety, paradoxically, can be more unsettling. When nothing dramatic happens, when there is no chase, no explosion, no confrontation, the mind has fewer places to hide. It must sit with the question. Alberta's geography adds another layer to these echoes. Vast stretches of land, sparsely populated, where the horizon feels endless and the sky dominates perception. Places like this invite observation. They reward patience. They make small anomalies feel significant because there is so little else competing for attention. This is why UAP reports cluster in such regions, not because the phenomena choose them, necessarily, but because humans notice more when the canvas is uncluttered. By 2025, Canada was quietly accumulating reports. Hundreds each year. Most never reached public awareness. Some were filed away, categorized, resolved. Others remained open, their details insufficient for closure. Only a fraction were formally reported at all. Pilots hesitated. Civilians assumed someone else would speak up, and sometimes, after submitting a report, nothing happened. No follow-up, no explanation. Just silence. Silence, too, becomes part of the pattern. Online, a new kind of echo chamber formed. Citizen analysts, researchers, and enthusiasts compared cases across decades, looking for similarities in shape, behavior, and context. Cylinders appeared again and again. Pills, tubes, elongated forms that resisted easy classification. Some explanations were convincing. High-altitude research balloons can appear rigid at distance. Payloads can create the illusion of unusual shapes. Wind can mimic deliberate motion when perspective is misunderstood. But not every case fit neatly, and so the Alberta Cylinder found its place in this long, quiet lineage. Not as proof of anything extraordinary, but as a continuation of a conversation that humanity has been having with the sky for generations. A conversation that sounds something like this. We noticed. We don't understand. We're still paying attention. What makes this moment different is not the object itself, but the readiness of the listener. Societies had changed. Institutions had shifted. Curiosity was no longer something to be buried. It was something cautiously encouraged. Still, answers did not rush in. No official statement connected Alberta to Yukon. No confirmation linked it to known programs. No dismissal quieted the questions entirely. The incident hovered, unresolved, much like its predecessors. And perhaps that is its role. Not every mystery exists to be solved quickly. Some exist to teach patience, to remind us that understanding unfolds slowly, through patterns rather than revelations. When you place the Alberta Cylinder alongside its Echoes Project Blue Book files, Ghost Rockets, Mansfield, Yukon, you begin to see not a single anomaly, but a tapestry. Threads crossing time, woven lightly, leaving spaces between them. Spaces where imagination could run wild if left unchecked, but also spaces where careful thought could grow. This is the balance the story asks for. Neither blind belief nor dismissive certainty. Just attention. Just willingness to sit with what isn't clear. Because the sky does not owe us explanations, it offers moments, invitations, glimpses, and each generation decides how to respond as the echoes fade into the present. One realization becomes unavoidable. The Alberta sighting is less about a shape in the sky, and more about how we, collectively, listen when history speaks softly, not with answers, but with repetition. And as these echoes settle, attention begins to shift not back to the sky, but toward the people and systems tasked with interpreting what was seen. Chapter 3. The Witnesses Who Know the Sky. High above the sleeping world, where the air thins and the horizon curves gently away, the sky becomes a language of its own. For those who work there, it is not mysterious. It is practical, measured, familiar. Pilots do not look at the sky the way the rest of us do. When you and I glance upward, we search for beauty or distraction. Clouds shaped like animals. Colors at sunset, a passing plane leaving a white scar across blue. But pilots read the sky the way sailors read the sea. Every movement means something. Every shape has a purpose. Every light has a reason. That is why this story cannot move forward without them. On the night of the Alberta Cylinder sighting, nothing felt unusual at first. The aircraft was settled into cruise, steady at 39,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed, behind the cockpit door. Instruments glowed softly. Engines hummed with the familiar rhythm of controlled power. This phase of flight is usually the quietest. No takeoff tension. No landing calculations. Just long minutes of monitoring systems, scanning airspace, and letting routine do what it was designed to do. The pilots weren't searching for anything. They weren't anticipating surprises. They weren't chasing curiosity. They were working, which is precisely why the moment stands out. At that altitude, airspace is ordered. Objects are tracked, coordinated, announced. Aircraft follow invisible highways, mapped by data and protocol. Even weather formations are predicted, plotted, expected. So when something appears where nothing should be, it creates a subtle unease, not fear, not panic, but a tightening of attention, a second look. Then a third. Outside the cockpit window, against the immense stillness of the upper sky, a shape held its place. Not flickering, not tumbling, not drifting like debris. Holding, long, smooth, featureless. The mind of a pilot moves quickly through possibilities. Aircraft? No wings. No tail. Drone? Too high balloon. Perhaps but something doesn't quite align. Weather phenomena, the outline is too defined. Reflection, the angle is wrong. Training kicks in, but training relies on categories, and this object refuses to settle into any of them. There is a moment, rarely discussed, when expertise meets uncertainty, when knowledge doesn't fail, exactly but pauses, when experience offers no immediate label. That pause is important. It's not excitement, it's responsibility, because at 39,000 feet, anything unidentified matters. Pilots are not encouraged to speculate. They are encouraged to report. Calmly, precisely, without embellishment, without assumption. And that is what happened. The object did not announce itself with speed. It did not streak or flare. It simply hovered, as if unaware that it had violated expectations. Then, without warning, it moved. Not gradually, not along a predictable path. It transitioned from stillness to acceleration in a way that felt abrupt, clean, as though motion itself had been switched on. No exhaust plume followed. No sound reached the cockpit. No sonic disturbance rippled through the air. Just departure. The pilots did not gasp. They did not shout. Their voices, later described in reports, remained measured. Professional. Almost restrained. That restraint is often misunderstood. Some assume calm means indifference, but in aviation, calm is clarity. It is the discipline that keeps people alive, and clarity is what gives these reports weight. Commercial pilots undergo thousands of hours of training. They study aircraft, silhouettes the way doctors study anatomy. They practice identifying threats under stress. They learn to trust instruments, but also to question them. They know the tricks the sky can play. They know about parallax, perspective, reflections, mirages. They know how distance compresses motion and exaggerates size. They know how easy it is for the untrained eye to be misled. And still, this object did not resolve into something familiar. This is where skepticism deserves its place. Pilots, like all humans, can be mistaken. Fatigue exists. Perception shifts. Context influences interpretation. But aviation systems are built around redundancy for a reason. Multiple observers, multiple instruments, multiple layers of verification. Even when data is incomplete, the act of reporting signals something important. The system noticed an anomaly, and anomalies are not ignored. They are logged, filed, stored. Sometimes they wait. What happened next, or rather, what didn't happen, is just as telling. There was no public announcement, no press briefing, no official acknowledgement that reached beyond quiet internal channels. Unlike the Yukon incident, 2 years earlier, no military intercept was reported, no images released, no follow-up explanation offered. Too many. This silence feels unsettling, but within aviation culture, silence is familiar. Not every report triggers action. Not every anomaly escalates. Many are categorized quickly and moved aside. The question is, categorized as what? Here answers thin out, without official commentary. The story drifted into the spaces, between institutions, noticed by researchers, whispered about online, debated briefly before attention moved elsewhere. But pilots, remember, aviation professionals, often carry these moments quietly. They mention them only to colleagues who understand the weight of responsibility. People who know the difference between storytelling and reporting. There is a reason pilot testimony has become central to modern UAP discussions. Not because pilots are infallible, but because they are accountable. Their words are traceable, their credentials verifiable, their incentives aligned with safety, not spectacle. In the past, pilots were discouraged from speaking. Reports risked careers. Questions invited ridicule. Silence felt safer. By 2025, that culture was beginning to shift. Congressional hearings in the United States had reframed the issue reporting. Anomalies was no longer treated as incompetence. It was treated as diligence. Canada's sky. Canada Project echoed this change, quietly acknowledging that Unidentified objects in controlled airspace deserved structured attention. Still, change moves slowly. The Alberta pilots did what professionals do. Tay reported continued their flight and trusted the system to decide what mattered. Whether the system responded or simply absorbed the report is harder to know, and that uncertainty introduces the next layer of the story. Because when institutions say nothing, curiosity does not disappear. It migrates. Online communities began to piece together what little information existed. Comparisons surfaced. Yukon, tic-tac, gimbal, horseshoe shapes, cylinders, pills. Patterns were drawn carefully by some recklessly, by others, and in the absence of data, the imagination filled the gaps. But it's important to pause here. The pilots did not claim extraterrestrials. They did not suggest secret technology. They did not offer conclusions. They offered observation. Everything beyond that came later. This distinction matters because it reminds us that the core of this story is not belief, it is perception under responsibility. It is trained eyes encountering something that resists immediate explanation and choosing to report it anyway. There is courage in that restraint. As the sky returned to normal and the aircraft continued its path, the moment receded, but it did not vanish. It settled into memory, into records, into the quiet archive of things that happened without resolution. And perhaps that is where it belongs for now. Because before we can ask what the object was, we must understand who saw it and why their perspective reshapes how seriously we listen. The sky may hold the mystery, but the witnesses anchor it to reality. And as attention shifts away from the cockpit, another question slowly comes into focus, one that has less to do with observation and more to do with response. Not what was seen, but how those in power chose to handle it. Chapter 4. Silence, Systems, and What Isn't Said. After the moment passes, after the object departs, and the sky returns to its familiar stillness, there is always a pause. Not in the air, but on the ground. This is the part of the story most people never see. No glowing shapes, no dramatic maneuvers, just paperwork, protocols, and quiet decisions made far from public view. Once the aircraft landed, and passengers went on with their lives, the sighting did not disappear. It entered a system layered, procedural, and deliberately slow. Aviation systems are designed for order, not mystery. Every anomaly becomes a report. Every report becomes data. And data, once logged, follows pathways shaped by policy rather than curiosity. At least, that's how it's meant to work. In theory, an unidentified object observed at cruising altitude should trigger a sequence. The report moves through airline safety channels. It may be flagged for review. It may be forwarded to national aviation authorities. If military sensors overlap the region, data might be cross-checked quietly in the background. But theory and practice don't always align. Most reports never reach the public, because most reports are resolved quickly, or labeled as resolved. A balloon, a reflection, a sensor artifact. A line of text is added. The case is closed. What makes the Alberta incident unusual is not that this process occurred, but that nothing emerged from it. No statement clarifying the object's identity. No reassurance offered publicly. No explanation, even a mundane one. Just absence. Silence is often interpreted as concealment, but in bureaucratic systems, silence usually means something simpler. The event did not meet the threshold required to speak. Thresholds matter. They are shaped by risk assessments, by precedent, by political context. An object that does not threaten safety may not justify a press release. An anomaly without corroborating data may not warrant attention beyond internal review. From an institutional perspective, speaking too often can create noise. From a public perspective, not speaking at all creates uncertainty. The Alberta Cylinder fell into this narrow gap. It was significant enough to be noticed by trained professionals, but not significant enough apparently to be addressed publicly. And that creates tension, because modern societies are accustomed to explanation. We live in an age where satellites track storms days in advance, where aircraft positions are visible on public apps, where data flows constantly invisible. When something interrupts that flow, it feels unsettling not because of what it might be, but because of what it reveals about the limits of transparency. Canada's aviation and defense systems are not disorganized. They are layered by design. Civil aviation authorities focus on safety. Military organizations focus on security. Scientific bodies focus on analysis. Each has its own language, priorities, and thresholds. The Alberta report may have touched all three or only one. We don't know. And not knowing invites interpretation. Some argue the silence suggests a prosaic explanation too dull to mention. Others see it as evidence of quiet classification. Still, others believe it reflects an unresolved case parked indefinitely due to lack of data. All three possibilities can coexist. This is where the story shifts away from the object and toward the system observing it, because the object did not choose silence. People did. The Sky Canada project, launched earlier in 2025, had already acknowledged a long-standing problem. Canada lacked a centralized, transparent process for handling UAP reports. Data was scattered across agencies. Standards varied. Reports were often siloed. The project recommended change, coordination, clarity, but recommendations take time to become reality. The Alberta sighting occurred during this transitional moment, after awareness had risen, but before new structures were fully in place. It arrived in between, and in transitional periods, systems often default to old habits. Minimal engagement, limited disclosure, quiet archiving. This is not necessarily malicious. Bureaucracies are cautious by nature. They move slowly, because the consequences of movement can be unpredictable. Yet for the public, slow movement feels like avoidance, especially when comparisons exist. 2 years earlier, the Yukon object prompted immediate action. Military intercept, public acknowledgement, declassified imagery, clear, if unsatisfying, explanation. Why the difference? Context matters. The Yukon object was detected by military sensors and posed potential airspace concerns tied to national security. It crossed thresholds quickly. It demanded response. The Alberta object, by contrast, was reported by civilian aviation without publicly known sensor confirmation. It did not trigger alarms. It did not linger. It did not repeat. From a systems perspective, it remained ambiguous. Ambiguity is uncomfortable, but it is also easy to shelve. And so the Alberta Cylinder settled into a familiar place in UAP history. Documented but undefined, outside official channels. However, the silence spoke loudly. Online discussions filled the vacuum. Analysts compared timelines, aviation enthusiasts reviewed flight paths. UAP researchers mapped similarities across cases. In the absence of answers, attention sharpened. But attention without data has limits. Speculation grows quickly, yet it rarely converges. One explanation branches into 10. 10 into 100. Certainty dissolves into argument. This is why silence, even when well-intentioned, can amplify confusion. Not because people demand extraordinary explanations, but because they seek closure. Closure doesn't require revelation. It requires acknowledgement. A simple statement: we reviewed this. Here is what we know. Here's what we don't. The absence of that statement leaves the story unfinished, and unfinished stories linger. They remain in forums, in research notes, in quiet conversations between professionals who recognize the pattern. They become part of the long memory of aerospace anomalies, moments when the system noticed something but did not speak. This chapter of the story does not offer answers. It offers context. It shows how an event can be real, recorded, and yet effectively invisible. How institutional silence can be misread as secrecy. How caution can feel like evasion. And how in the modern world, absence of information is rarely neutral, as attention drifts away from the object itself. A deeper question emerges, one that has nothing to do with cylinders or skies. What does transparency mean in an age of uncertainty? How much should institutions share when they don't have certainty themselves? And what happens when systems designed for order encounter questions they were never built to answer? These questions linger quietly, like contrails dissolving into clear air. And thus they do. The story prepares to move again not upward toward the sky, but outward into the wider world where public perception, technology, and belief begin to shape the narrative. Because once silence settles, something else always follows interpretation. Chapter 5. When curiosity finds a voice, silence never lasts as long as institutions expect it to. When official channels grow quiet, something else begins to stir not loudly. Not all at once, but gently, like a ripple spreading across still water. Curiosity does not vanish simply because answers are withheld. It looks for another path, and in the modern world, it almost always finds one. Long before newspapers notice, before statements are drafted or withheld, stories begin moving through informal networks, aviation forums, research groups, late-night conversations between people who have learned to listen carefully to the margins of official narratives. The Alberta Cylinder entered this space quietly, not as a headline, not as a viral clip, but as a whisper of information passed between those who know how to read between lines. Someone mentions a pilot report. Someone else recognizes the altitude. Another notices the shape sounds familiar. And suddenly, the story is alive. Online, curiosity takes many forms. Some people arrive with skepticism sharpened by years of disappointment. Others arrive with open wonder, hopeful that this time something truly new has slipped into view. Most sit somewhere in between, careful, cautious, but undeniably interested. This is where modern UAP research has changed the most. It no longer belongs solely to governments or military archives. It has spilled into civilian hands, into bedrooms lit by laptop screens, into late hours where footage is slowed, stabilized, measured, debated. Citizen analysts begin their work the same way scientists always have. By comparing patterns, they look at the description of the Alberta object and place it beside others: Yukon, Tick-tock, gimbal, horseshoe shapes captured over South Korea. Cylinders reported decades apart, continents away. They ask quiet questions. Why this shape? Why this altitude? Why this timing? Some explanations appear quickly. High-altitude balloons can take on rigid forms. Payloads can distort silhouettes. Perspective can make slow movement feel sudden. Thermal gradients can bend light in strange ways. These explanations are not dismissive. They are necessary. But then come the moments that resist them: the lack of visible tether, the abrupt acceleration, the absence of exhaust or sound, the way the object seemed deliberate. Citizen analysts are careful not to rush conclusions. The most experienced among them understand how easily imagination can outrun evidence. They speak in probabilities, not certainties. They ask for raw data they know may never arrive. And yet, even careful analyses cannot fill every gap. Without video, without sensor logs, without radar confirmation, the Alberta Cylinder remains largely conceptual, built from testimony and context, rather than pixels and plots. Still, something important happens here. The story becomes shared. It moves from isolated report to communal puzzle, from something that happened to someone else into something many people are quietly thinking about together. This is not hysteria. It is collective attention, and attention, when focused, has power. It pressures institutions not aggressively, but persistently. It keeps questions alive. It prevents quiet disappearance. In past decades, cases like this might have faded entirely, remembered only by those directly involved. But digital memory is different. It does not forget easily. It archives conversations, saves threads, preserves analysis long after headlines move on. The Alberta Cylinder becomes a reference point, not proof, not revelation, a marker. People begin using it to test ideas. If this was a balloon, what kind could reach that altitude in September? If it was a drone, who has the capability to operate it silently at that height? If it was atmospheric, what conditions would produce such a stable, defined form? Each question branches into more questions. And this is where tension quietly grows, because curiosity is patient, but it is also cumulative. As more reports surface globally in 2025, unidentified drones along coastlines, anomalies over training zones, objects briefly entering restricted airspace. The Alberta case gains new relevance. It becomes part of a larger pattern, not of shapes, but of uncertainty. The conversation shifts subtly. It is no longer just about what these objects are. It becomes about how societies respond when the sky refuses to explain itself. Some voices grow louder, demanding answers. Others urge restraint, reminding everyone how often mysteries resolve into ordinary explanations with time. Between them sits a quieter group, advocating something less dramatic, but more difficult. Patience paired with rigor. This group understands something essential. Curiosity does not require belief. It requires humility. The Alberta Cylinder invites that humility by offering very little to hold on to. No video to obsess over, no official statement to dissect. Just a moment, reported honestly, then released into uncertainty. That restraint frustrates some. It comforts others. For bedtime listeners, those drawn not to shock but to reflection, this is where the story deepens, because it mirrors something familiar. We have all encountered moments we cannot explain, a sound in the night, a coincidence too precise, a glance that lingers longer than expected. Most of the time, we do not resolve these moments. We absorb them, carry them quietly, let them shape how we look at the world. The Alberta Cylinder functions the same way. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't insist on meaning. It simply asks to be remembered. As discussions continue, a soft realization spreads through the community. Paying attention, the object itself may never be identified, but its impact already exists. It has exposed how much we rely on trust. Trust in systems. Trust in transparency. Trust that if something matters, someone will tell us. And when that trust wavers, curiosity steps in to fill the space. This is not rebellion. It is human nature. Stories have always emerged, where official narratives fall silent. Myths, legends, folklore. Not because people wanted fantasy, but because they needed continuity. A way to hold unresolved experience without discarding it. The Alberta Cylinder is becoming modern folklore. In its earliest stage, not exaggerated, not dramatized, but held carefully, like something fragile. People speak of it softly. They avoid grand claims. They wait, and waiting, in a world accustomed to instant answers, is its own form of tension. As nights pass and attention ebbs and flows, one thing becomes clear. Curiosity has given this incident a second life. Not a spectacle, but as a question that refuses to dissolve. And that question begins to turn inward. If we are seeing more of these moments, if reporting is increasing, if systems are struggling to keep pace, what does that say about the world we're living in now? This thought lingers gently, like the afterimage of light when eyes close. And as curiosity settles into something deeper, something more reflective, the story begins preparing for its next movement, away from speculation toward meaning. Because eventually, every unanswered question stops asking what and begins asking why. Chapter 6. The Quiet Shift in the Sky. Something subtle begins to change. Not in the sky itself, but in how people look at it. It doesn't happen overnight. There is no announcement, no clear moment when curiosity becomes awareness. It arrives the way dawn does during sleep, quietly reshaping the world before anyone realizes. It has already begun. After the Alberta Cylinder, after the conversations and patient debates, a softer realization starts to spread. Among those who are paying attention, the sky is no longer just background. For most of modern life, the sky has been a place of routine. Planes follow predictable paths. Satellites glide invisibly overhead. Weather behaves according to charts and forecasts. The heavens feel mapped, measured, owned by schedules and systems. But now, a faint uncertainty drifts in. People begin to pause when they hear an aircraft overhead, not with fear, just awareness. A second, longer than before, a moment of listening. Pilots especially feel this shift first. Those who spend their lives above the clouds develop a particular relationship with the sky. It is not romantic or mystical. It is practical, intimate, built on trust. Instruments speak, Air currents respond, the horizon behaves as expected. Yet quietly, more pilots begin to share stories not publicly, not dramatically, but among peers. A shape that didn't behave correctly. A light had paced them for seconds too long. A radar return that vanished before it could be logged. Most of these stories never reach the public. They live in conversations over coffee, in private messages, in careful phrasing designed to avoid ridicule. And that is part of the shift. People are still cautious, but they are less dismissive. Something about recent years has softened the wall between possible and impossible. Technology has advanced too quickly. Drones can do what once felt unreal. Artificial intelligence behaves in ways that feel almost alive. Space is no longer abstracted. It's commercial, reachable, busy. So when something unusual appears in the sky, the mind no longer rushes to label it absurd. Instead, it asks, what category haven't we built yet? This question lingers gently, without urgency. News outlets, sensing the change, adjust their language. Articles avoid absolute conclusions. Headlines pose questions rather than statements. Words like anomaly, unidentified, and unresolved become more common, not sensational, just honest. Government agencies remain careful. Silence is still their most consistent response. But silence, in this new atmosphere, feels different. It feels heavier. In the absence of explanation, people begin to notice patterns not in shapes or trajectories, but in timing. Why now? Why do these reports seem to cluster in recent years? Why are trained observers pilots, radar operators, military personnel more willing to speak cautiously but openly? Some suggest better reporting systems. Others point to social permission. When one person speaks without consequence, others follow. But beneath these explanations is a quieter possibility. Perhaps nothing has changed in the sky at all. Perhaps what has changed is us. Our tolerance for uncertainty has grown. Our willingness to sit with unanswered questions has matured. We no longer demand immediate closure in the same way. This does not mean belief has replaced skepticism. It means curiosity has replaced denial. For bedtime listeners, this moment in the story feels like standing at a window late at night. The world is still familiar. And yet, something in the darkness feels slightly different, not threatening, just alive. People begin looking up more often, not searching, not scanning, just noticing. The stars seem sharper, satellites easier to track, the movement of clouds more intentional somehow, though nothing has actually changed. And then, there are the moments that don't fit. A stationary light that slowly fades without moving. A shape that reflects moonlight at an impossible angle. A flash where nothing should be. Most of these moments are forgotten by morning. But some stay. They join the growing collection of quiet experiences people don't rush to explain. This is the awakening phase, though few would call it that. It is not dramatic. There are no revelations whispered in dreams. No sudden understanding. It is simply a shift in posture from certainty to openness. Researchers notice it too. Scientists, who once avoided the topic entirely, now speak carefully about unknowns. Universities fund small studies into atmospheric anomalies and censor errors, not because they expect extraterrestrial answers, but because acknowledging ignorance is part of science. And yet, even science has limits. There are questions that data alone cannot soothe. Questions about intention, about awareness, about whether intelligence must always announce itself loudly to exist. The Alberta Cylinder resurfaces, occasionally, in these discussions, not as evidence but as a reminder that something observed by trained eyes, under controlled conditions, can still escape classification. And that fact, more than any theory, stays with people, because it suggests a world that is not fully catalogued, a reality that still has room for surprise. Late-at-night listeners may find themselves thinking about this as they drift toward sleep, not in terms of visitors or craft or distant civilizations, but in terms of humility. What else exists just beyond our categories? What else moves quietly through systems we assume are complete? These thoughts do not disturb rest. They soften it. They allow the mind to release control, to accept that not everything needs a label before it can be real. And somewhere in that acceptance, curiosity deepens into something calmer. A readiness, not for answers, but for the possibility that answers may arrive slowly, gently, when we are finally quiet enough to hear them. As the sky continues its silent watch, and people continue their ordinary lives beneath it, this quiet shift settles in. Nothing looks different, but everything feels slightly more open. And that openness prepares the ground for the next phase of the story one, where questions begin to turn outward again, not as demands, but as invitations. Because when awareness awakens, truth no longer needs to shout. It only needs to appear. And sometimes it already has. Chapter 7. When questions learn to breathe, there is a moment, subtle and almost unnoticeable, when a question stops demanding an answer. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't resolve. It simply relaxes. This is where the story rests, now not in discovery, not in denial, but in a kind of quiet maturity. The questions surrounding the Alberta sighting, and others like it, no longer feel sharp or restless. They begin to breathe. People who once argued fiercely now speak more slowly. Conversations soften. Certainty loosens its grip. It's not that anyone knows more. It's that they are no longer afraid of knowing less. Late at night, when the world settles and the noise thins out, these questions feel different. They don't arrive as puzzles to be solved, but as companions, gentle presences that sit beside the listener rather than pulling them forward. What was seen in the sky that day? The question remains, but it no longer carries urgency. It carries curiosity. And curiosity, when unburdened by fear, becomes something else entirely. It becomes listening. Across different parts of the world, small groups form not movements, not organizations, but circles of quiet attention. Pilots, scientists, engineers, artists, ordinary people with an uncommon patience for ambiguity. They don't gather to prove anything. They gather to notice. Someone mentions an old sighting from decades ago, forgotten until now. Another recalls a childhood memory of a light that didn't behave like stars were supposed to. A third speaks about data gaps, places where instruments go silent, not because nothing happened, but because nothing fit. These are not dramatic stories. They are almost fragile in their restraint, and that restraint makes them powerful. Because, for the first time, the topic isn't being carried by belief or disbelief. It's being carried by experience. There is a quiet understanding spreading beneath these conversations. Reality may be larger than the frameworks we've built to explain it. Not stranger, not hostile, just larger. This realization doesn't provoke panic. It provokes humility. Humility has a calming effect. When people stop trying to dominate the unknown stops feeling like a threat. Even institutions begin to reflect this shift, slowly and imperfectly. Language changes first. Memos replace absolutes with probabilities. Reports acknowledge uncertainty instead of erasing it. Words like inconclusive appear more often not as failures, but as honest endpoints. This matters more than it seems, because admitting uncertainty creates space, and space invites patience. The Alberta Cylinder, now several steps removed from headlines and online debates, becomes something quieter still, a reference point, a marker in time when people collectively notice the limits of their explanations. It doesn't need to be extraordinary to be meaningful. In fact, its meaning grows precisely because it refuses to resolve itself. At night, as listeners drift closer to sleep, their thoughts wander gently through these ideas. The mind moves differently when it isn't chasing certainty. It wanders, it explores. What if intelligence doesn't announce itself with spectacle? What if observation doesn't require understanding to be valid? What if some things are meant to be noticed, not solved? These questions don't disturb rest. They deepen it. They allow the mind to settle into a wider sense of reality, one where mystery is not a problem, but a texture. The sky, too, seems to participate in this calm. Stars appear steady. Satellites pass like slow breaths. Planes trace familiar arcs of light. Nothing dramatic happens. And yet, the sky no longer feels empty. It feels aware. Not in a conscious way. Not in a narrative way. But in the way a forest feels aware when wind moves through it. Present without intention. Existence without explanation. People who once felt uneasy about not knowing now find comfort in it. The unknown becomes a place of rest rather than tension. There is relief in releasing the need to categorize everything immediately. Children do this naturally. They accept wonder without demanding answers. Somewhere along the way, adults forget that skill. Now, quietly, it returns. This is not disclosure in the traditional sense. No doors open, no truths spill out. No voices confirm or deny. Instead, there is a different kind of revelation. The realization that not all truths arrive as information. Some arrive as perspective, and perspective shifts slowly. Like the turning of the earth itself so gradual, you only notice it by the change in light. People begin to speak differently about the future, not with expectations of contact or revelation, but with openness. If something happens, we'll notice, someone says. And if nothing happens, another replies, we still learned something. What they learned is subtle, but profound. They learned how to sit with mystery without filling it with fear. They learned that not knowing does not mean being powerless. They learned that attention itself is a form of respect. As the night deepens and the story continues its gentle unfolding, this chapter settles into a kind of stillness. There is nothing to resolve here. Only something to recognize. The questions are still alive. But now, they are breathing. And in that shared breath between sky and ground, between observer and unknown, the story finds a quiet balance. A balance that prepares the way for what comes next. Because when questions are no longer chasing answers, something else becomes possible. Listening turns outward, and sometimes, when listening deepens enough, the world responds not with clarity, but with meaning. Chapter 8. The sky that doesn't rush. The sky has a way of teaching patience. Not by speaking, not by revealing, but by remaining exactly as it is, night after night. Long after the Alberta sightings slipped from headlines. Long after debates cooled and online threads went quiet, the sky continued its slow routines. Planes crossed invisible highways. Satellites glided like unblinking thoughts. Stars held their ancient positions, unmoved by human curiosity. Nothing hurried, and slowly, neither did the people who kept looking up. There is a change that happens when attention stretches over time. At first, watching the sky feels active, searching, scanning, hoping to notice something unusual, but eventually, watching becomes something else. It becomes waiting without expectation. People still step outside at night, still pause mid-thought. When a light moves strangely, still feel that faint pull in the chest when something doesn't quite fit. But the urgency is gone. The sky does not owe answers, and somehow, that feels okay. This shift doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, like realizing you're breathing slower than before. The Alberta Cylinder becomes part of a wider, softer understanding that whatever happened that day was not an interruption, but a continuation. A reminder that the sky has always been more complex than it appears. Pilots feel this most clearly. Up there, above weather and cities, the world already feels unreal. Borders dissolve. Time stretches. The horizon curves in ways you don't notice from the ground. When pilots talk about strange sightings now, their voices carry less tension. They don't sound shaken. They sound thoughtful, as if the experience didn't frighten them, but changed the way they perceive space. One pilot describes it like this: "It wasn't that I saw something impossible. It was that I realized how little of the sky we actually understand. That realization lingers, not as doubt, but as expansion." Underground researchers continue their quiet work, not chasing proof, not promising breakthroughs, just refining methods, improving sensors, cross-checking data, building systems that don't rush to conclusions. They've learned that most answers reveal themselves only when you stop demanding them. Data accumulate slowly. Patterns emerge softly. A reported correlation there. Nothing dramatic. But together, they form a new relationship with the unknown. One rooted in steadiness rather than shock. Even language begins to soften further. Words like object give way to phenomena. Words like incident give way to event. Subtle changes, but meaningful ones. Because language shapes how the mind holds mystery. At night, as listeners drift towards sleep, the Alberta story blends into a larger rhythm. It's no longer isolated. It sits among countless other times when humans noticed something beyond explanation and chose not to turn away. Ancient stargazers did this. So did sailors navigating by uncertain lights. So did early scientists staring into skies that refused to behave as expected. Uncertainty has always been part of awareness. We just forgot that for a while. Now, gently, we're remembering. The sky doesn't rush because it doesn't need to. It has nothing to prove. It doesn't reward belief or punish skepticism. It simply exists. And existence, when observed long enough, becomes intimate. There's a comfort in knowing that whatever crossed the Alberta sky didn't disrupt anything essential. Flights continued. The world kept turning. Life carried on, yet something shifted beneath the surface. People became better listeners, better observers, better at holding open-ended truths. That might be the real significance of sightings like this, not the objects themselves, but the way they train attention. They teach us how to notice without controlling, how to wonder without inventing, how to stay awake without becoming restless. In a culture that demands instant explanations, this is a rare skill. The night deepens, dudes. The story breathes. Somewhere above, the sky remains unchanged and entirely different depending on how you look at it. And maybe that's the lesson settling in now. That mystery doesn't need resolution to be meaningful. That awareness itself is a kind of arrival. And that sometimes the most profound disclosures don't come as revelations, but as a quiet understanding that the sky has always been inviting us to slow down and listen. Short transition line. And as attention steadies, a deeper realization begins to form. Chapter 9. The Quiet Agreement. At some point, without ceremony or announcement, a quiet agreement forms. No one signs it. No one names it. And yet, it spreads. It's the shared understanding that not everything needs to be forced into explanation right away. This agreement doesn't reject science. It doesn't dismiss skepticism. It simply changes the pace. It allows space between observation and conclusion. A pause long enough for meaning to settle. The Alberta sighting now lives inside that pause. It is not forgotten. It is not solved. It's held. People who follow these events closely begin to recognize this shift in themselves. They notice how their reactions have changed. Where once there was urgency, there is now patience. Where once there was frustration, there is curiosity without demand. Even disagreement feels different. Two people can look at the same account and walk away with different interpretations. Balloon, drone, atmospheric effect, something else entirely. And neither feels compelled to convince the other. That in itself is new. The conversation has matured. In living rooms, quiet studies, and late-night walks, the topic of unexplained sightings comes up gently, not as an argument starter, but as a shared wondering. Did you hear about that thing over Alberta? Someone asks. Yes, another replies. Strange, wasn't it? And that's enough. No escalation, no need to win the moment, just acknowledgement. This quiet agreement doesn't belong just for fans and curious minds. It reaches people who never thought much about the sky at all, the ones who glance upward now and then, not searching, just noticing. They don't expect to see anything unusual, but they are open to the possibility that they might. That openness changes how the world feels. The sky becomes less of a backdrop and more of a presence. Still familiar, but no longer taken for granted. In this state of mind, even ordinary sights feel richer. A plane reflecting sunlight, a satellite flaring briefly before vanishing, a star pulsing faintly through thin cloud. Each moment carries the quiet question, What am I really seeing? Not in doubt, but in awareness. Institutions, to begin to reflect this unspoken agreement. Reports are written with care. Language is chosen thoughtfully. Silence, when it appears, feels less like concealment and more like restraint. Sometimes, not speaking is a form of honesty. The Alberta case remains officially unverified, unresolved, unclaimed by any authority, and strangely, that no longer feels like failure. It feels like integrity, because forcing certainty where there is none only creates distortion. This understanding spread slowly, like dusk replacing daylight, no sharp edge, just a gradual change in tone. The world feels calmer around its mysteries. At night, as listeners sink deeper into rest, the story moves with them not forward, not backward, but inward, toward a quieter place where questions don't echo loudly, but resonate softly. This is where curiosity becomes companionship rather than pursuit, where the unknown is no longer an adversary, where attention rests without effort. The Alberta Cylinder no longer stands alone as an event. It becomes part of a broader pattern of human experience, moments when reality reminds us that our maps are not the territory. And that's okay. Maps evolve. So do we. The quiet agreement doesn't promise answers tomorrow, or next year, or ever. It simply promises honesty with ourselves, with our observations, with the limits of our knowledge. And in that promise, there is peace. The sky remains wide. The questions remain alive. And the story continues not toward resolution, but toward understanding that doesn't require it. Short transition line. And from this shared stillness, a deeper sense of meaning begins to emerge. Chapter 10. Meaning without answers. There is a strange relief in realizing that meaning does not always arrive with explanations. For a long time, people believed the two were inseparable, that understanding required answers, and that answers were the final goal of curiosity. But slowly, quietly, another truth begins to surface. Some things offer meaning long before they offer clarity. The Alberta sighting has become one of those things. It no longer sits in the mind like a question mark. It rests there more like a symbol, soft-edged, open, unfinished. And symbols do not demand to be solved. They invite reflection. People notice how often this happens in life. A look from a stranger that lingers just a second too long. A dream that fades but leaves an emotional trace. A memory whose details blur while its feeling stays sharp. We don't dismiss these experiences because they lack explanation. We carry them because they matter. The Alberta Cylinder begins to feel similar. Not proof of anything extraordinary. Not evidence of anything hidden. Just an encounter with the limits of knowing. And limits, when acknowledged, can be grounding. Researchers sense this shift as well. The pressure to crack the case eases. Instead, attention turns toward refining questions rather than racing toward conclusions. What conditions allow certain phenomena to appear? Why do some observations resist classification? What does uncertainty reveal about our tools and about ourselves? These are not dramatic questions. They don't thrill headlines, but they shape understanding in quieter, more durable ways. In T-space, interdisciplinary conversations deepen. Atmospheric scientists speak with astronomers. Engineers compare notes with psychologists. Pilots share insights with data analysts. Not to chase mystery, but to respect it. Because mystery handled with care becomes a teacher. At night, when the mind drifts into that gentle half-awareness between waking and sleep, these ideas settle naturally. They don't intrude. They blend. The story feels less like a narrative and more like a landscape, something you move through slowly, noticing different details depending on where you stand. Sometimes, meaning emerges, not from what happened in the sky, but from how people responded to it. The patience, the restraint. The willingness to say, we don't know, and that's acceptable. This response marks a quiet evolution. For generations, the unknown provoked fear or fantasy. Now, increasingly, it invites reflection. That shift matters. It changes how future events will be met. It prepares the mind for complexity without panic. It strengthens the habit of observation without attachment. The Alberta sighting becomes part of that preparation, not as a warning, not as a revelation, but as a reminder that reality is layered, that perception is limited, that humility expands awareness rather than shrinking it. People who once needed certainty now find comfort in openness. They stop asking, "What was it?" and begin asking, "What did it change?" The answer, for many, is subtle but profound. It changed how they listen, how they look up, how they sit with unanswered questions. As the night deepens, this chapter rests in that realization. There is nothing more to uncover here, only something to recognize. Meaning doesn't always arrive as information. Sometimes it arrives as peace, and with that peace, attention gently turns toward what comes next. Chapter 11. The sky. After a question loosens its grip, the mind begins to notice different things. The sky, for example. Not the dramatic sky of storms or sunsets that demand attention, but the everyday one. The wide, patient ceiling above cities and fields. The same sky that had always been there. Unnoticed precisely because it was dependable. After Alberta, some people began looking at that sky differently. Not with expectation, not with suspicion, but with awareness. Pilots felt it first. There is a rhythm to flying at altitude. A steady hum, a stable horizon, a sense of moving through something vast, yet regulated. The sky is mapped, monitored, predicted. It is meant to be known. And yet, once in a while, something unsettles that certainty, not violently, not alarmingly, but gently, like a hand resting on the shoulder. A reminder. The pilots who heard about the Alberta sighting didn't suddenly start searching for strange objects. They didn't change how they flew, but a quiet adjustment occurred. A longer glance, a second check, a deeper respect for what instruments show and what they don't. In crew lounges and briefing rooms, the story surfaced in fragments, not as gossip, but as reflection. "Did you hear about that one over Alberta?" "Yeah." "Strange." No follow-up, apparently. "Still, interesting." Then the conversation would drift elsewhere. Weather, roots, coffee. But something stayed. It's often like that. The most meaningful moments rarely announce themselves. They slip into the background and alter the way the background feels. For civilians, the change arrived differently. People driving at night found themselves slowing down. Windows cracked open, eyes drifting upward at red lights. Hikers paused longer on ridgelines. Campers lay awake in tents, listening to wind and distant traffic, watching stars emerge one by one. The sky became less of a backdrop and more of a presence. Not a stage for visitors, not a canvas for speculation. Just a vast, shared space that still held surprises. This is what happens when curiosity matures. It stops demanding performance. The Alberta incident didn't make people expect another sighting. It made them more comfortable with the idea that not everything reveals itself on schedule, and that comfort is rare. Modern life trains us to resolve everything quickly. Search engines provide answers before questions fully form. Notifications fill every pause. Silence feels unfinished. But the sky doesn't operate that way. It moves on longer time scales. It contains layers: weather, traffic, satellites, light, shadow that overlap without explanation. It doesn't rush to clarify itself. The Alberta Cylinder belonged to that slower rhythm. It appeared, it departed, and it left behind no instructions. That absence became instructive. In universities, a few quiet discussions took place, not panels or conferences, just conversations after lectures. How do we teach uncertainty? How do we model intellectual patience? How do we acknowledge anomalies without centering them? Some professors use the case as an example not of mystery, but of restraint. This is what responsible curiosity looks like, they said. Notice the difference between asking questions and demanding answers. Students listened. Some nodded, some felt frustrated. That frustration was part of the lesson, because not knowing feels uncomfortable only when we believe knowing is always possible. As the months passed, the Alberta story settled into archives, notes, bookmarked threads. It was no longer trending. It wasn't new And yet, it remained present in a quieter way. It had become a reference point. Not remember when that happened, but remember how we handled that. The way no one rushed to fill the silence. The way speculation was tempered. The way the sky was allowed to remain the sky. That might be the most unusual part of the entire event. Not the object. Not the altitude. Not the shape, but the response. Human beings, for once, did not insist on turning uncertainty into spectacle. They let it breathe, late at night, when the world softens and thoughts drift more freely. This chapter of the story feels almost complete. Not concluded, just settled, like a lake after a stone sinks beneath the surface. The ripples are gone. The water remains changed. People still look up. They still wonder. But they no longer expect the sky to explain itself. And that shift, subtle, nearly invisible, is where the story continues. Short transition line. As attention lifts from the sky itself, it slowly returns to those who live beneath it. Chapter 12. The Human Echo. Even after the sky has quieted, even after the initial stir of curiosity fades, something lingers, a human echo. It's not a sound you can hear, not a voice on the wind. It's more subtle. A sensation, a reflection, a reminder that what was observed, what was noticed, did not vanish entirely. It became part of collective awareness. Think about the people who watched that day over Alberta. The pilots at 39,000 feet. The air traffic controllers tracking blips on radar. The analysts sorting through reports in quiet offices. Even the casual observers scrolling online forums late at night. All of them carried a fragment of the event forward. Each carried it differently. Some with wonder. Some with doubt. Some with gentle anxiety that the world still holds things beyond explanation. But all carried the same seed. The awareness of something unexplained, something hovering just beyond ordinary perception. Human memory works strangely. Events that are incomplete tend to resonate longer than events that are fully understood. There is a subtle tension between what we perceive and what we can interpret. In this tension, imagination thrives, but so does reflection. Months later, conversations would resurface not as urgent debates, but as contemplative musings. Do you remember that pilot report from Alberta? Someone would ask in a quiet room. Yes, another would reply. It was strange, but maybe not in the way we imagined. And there it was, the echo, not judgment, not speculation, just recognition. The moment was absorbed into human consciousness in a calm, measured way. This echo also influences how people notice the small details in everyday life. Perhaps it's the shimmer of moonlight on a distant lake, a cloud moving oddly against the wind, or the sudden flicker of a distant plane's lights. Nothing threatening, nothing urgent, but each observation carries a gentle curiosity, a reminder. The sky can still surprise us, and we are awake enough to notice. The Alberta Cylinder may have disappeared from view, but it left its mark on perception itself. The pilots who reported it speak differently now about anomalies. They notice patterns in traffic or atmospheric phenomena more clearly. They pause longer, not because they fear the unknown, but because they respect it, even for those who never saw the object. Its story teaches something essential: the value of careful attention, of withholding immediate judgment, of appreciating the space between seeing and understanding. This echo spreads quietly, subtly, through shared experience. It informs how communities respond to reports of unusual phenomena. It tempers panic and encourages observation. It nurtures patience and reflection. Children who hear these stories in bedtime moment stories, told not with fear, but with wonder, carry this echo forward differently than adults. They learn early that the world contains mysteries that are not threats. They learn that it's acceptable to sit with uncertainty and still feel safe. This is the real gift of the Alberta sighting. It does not lie in proving what was seen. It does not lie in capturing dramatic footage or official statements. It lies in teaching humanity how to respond to the unknown with measured curiosity, with poise, and with openness. The human echo persists in quiet offices, in skies observed from airplanes, in late-night walks under faint stars. It is present wherever people remember the balance between noticing and understanding, between expectation and patience. And perhaps most poignantly, it teaches humility, to recognize that despite our tools, our sensors, and our data, the world retains layers we cannot immediately access. It encourages a gentle acceptance that life, observation, and consciousness are ongoing processes, and that sometimes the most profound discoveries emerge not from explanation, but from attention itself. This echo, soft but persistent, ensures that the Alberta Cylinder remains more than a fleeting anomaly. It becomes a thread woven into human experience, a reminder of the elegance of unknown phenomena, the subtlety of awareness, and the quiet power of restraint. And so the story settles gently into the minds of those willing to receive it, not as a challenge to be solved, but as an invitation to listen carefully, to see patiently, and to honor the moments that refuse to be fully explained. And in this echo, the world begins to see itself and the sky just a little differently. Chapter 13. Looking up. Together. The sky has a way of teaching patience, not through lessons shouted across the wind, but through quiet presence. Its vastness reminds us how small we are, and yet how connected. Alberta's cylinder, its sudden, inexplicable appearance, now rests in that space. Not gone, not conquered. Simply observed, after years of discussion, reports, and quiet reflection, a subtle shift occurs. People begin to look up differently, not because they expect to see something extraordinary every day, but because the act of looking has become purposeful. The sky is no longer taken for granted. Its routine presence now carries an attentive awareness, a gentle readiness. Communities of pilots, researchers, and everyday observers form invisible networks. They do not need to meet in person. Their connection is built on shared attention, on the patience to notice the unexpected without fear, and on the humility to admit that some mysteries might remain unsolved. These networks share a quiet understanding. The unknown is not an enemy. It is a companion in curiosity. At night, when cities dim and stars slowly emerge, those who remember the Alberta sighting feel a slight, unspoken anticipation not of certainty, but of possibility. They watch satellites trace arcs across the sky, notice the slow drift of clouds, and catch distant lights in ways they might have ignored before. Each observation, however ordinary, carries the gentle thrill of being awake to the world's subtle wonders. Children who grow up hearing stories of unexplained objects learn something even more delicate. They inherit not fear, not obsession, but the ability to pause, to ask questions without urgency, to appreciate that some phenomena exist to expand perception, not to frighten. These children trace shapes in clouds and find meaning in patterns that do not need to be solved. They understand that curiosity can exist without resolution, and that wonder is often its own reward. Meanwhile, scientists, once frustrated by fragmented data and sporadic reports, begin to see collaboration differently. They share methods, refine instruments, and document anomalies with care and patience. Alberta's incident serves as a quiet benchmark, reminding them that truth often emerges slowly, layered over time and observation, rather than in a single, dramatic revelation. The Alberta Cylinder has also reshaped conversations among civilians. Casual observers, who might have dismissed strange lights or fleeting shapes in the sky, now recognize the value of careful attention. Social media posts become measured. Forums host calm, thoughtful discussions rather than fevered speculation. Witnesses share observations, noting patterns, times, and environmental conditions. It's not about proving anything, it's about witnessing responsibly. Even governments, quietly and without fanfare, begin to reflect the lessons of restraint. Policies shift towards structured reporting, centralized observation, and transparency that balances public interest with safety and discretion. There's recognition that the sky is shared, and that responsible observation and reporting protect not only aviation, but the integrity of collective understanding. And in all this, there is a human thread. Running through the story, a reminder that the Alberta Cylinder is more than an object. It is a catalyst for patience, reflection, and shared wonder. It teaches restraint in the face of uncertainty and encourages respect for limits. The limits of perception, of understanding, and of immediate explanation. Sometimes, the most profound change occurs not because answers are found, but because people begin to notice differently. It's in the pauses during flights when pilots glance up, aware of every light, every shadow, every anomaly. It is in late-night walks where someone notices a subtle flicker in the sky and smiles without expectation. It's in classrooms and conversations where questions are encouraged, but urgency is soft. It's in journals, databases, and reports that record observations not for spectacle, but for continuity. The Alberta Cylinder, once a fleeting silhouette against the vast Canadian sky, has grown into something larger than itself. It is a reminder of humility and patience, a testament to the power of quiet curiosity, and a signal that the unknown does not always need to be conquered. It needs to be observed, respected, and allowed to exist alongside human understanding. And perhaps, above all, it teaches a gentle lesson. The sky belongs to everyone. And when we look up together carefully, patiently, without rush, we share more than observation. We share attention, presence, and the quiet joy of wonder that can last a lifetime. The story, at last, settles, not as an answer, but as an experience, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation. It is an enduring moment in human perception, a moment where the sky, the object, and those who watch it all converge, softly and meaningfully. It reminds us, sometimes looking up is enough, and when we do it together, the world feels larger, calmer, and infinitely more alive. And so the Alberta Cylinder drifts into memory, leaving behind the quiet light of curiosity in all who saw, remembered, and looked again. The sky has returned to its quiet rhythm. The clouds drift without urgency. The stars blink softly, unhurried, as if nothing unusual has ever touched them. And yet, something has changed. Those who witnessed, who listened, who remembered, they carry a subtle shift in how they see the world, a gentle awareness that even the ordinary can hold the extraordinary, that even in routine, there is space for wonder, that not every question needs a loud answer. Some simply need careful attention. The Alberta Cylinder is gone from sight. Its motion, its heat, its mysterious presence. They exist now in memory, in reflection in the human echo that traces the sky wherever eyes are lifted. And perhaps that is enough. Because this story, this quiet encounter above Alberta, was never really about proving or explaining. It was about noticing, about slowing down, about embracing uncertainty without fear, about holding space for curiosity to breathe. In the end, the sky remains vast and patient. It waits for those willing to look, to observe, to reflect, and to wonder. And when you lift your gaze, remember, sometimes the most important discoveries are not the ones that change the sky, but the ones that change the way we see it. So tonight, as you lie under the stars, let your mind drift gently across the endless expanse. Let your curiosity settle in, soft and steady, like a quiet companion. And know that even when answers are absent, attention itself carries its own quiet magic. Because the sky is always there, waiting, and so are you.